Is fighting a real army harder? The Israel-Gaza war debate. Explained, for years, the world watched one kind of war in Gaza, but now, critics say something has changed. Is confronting a real military force a completely different battlefield? And if that's true, what does it reveal about modern warfare, global power, and the future of conflict in the Middle East? Stay with this story, because the answer is far more complex than it first appears. Across television screens, news feeds, and social media platforms around the world, images from the Middle East continue to circulate almost constantly. Explosions, smoke rising over cities, damaged buildings, and frightened civilians have once again brought the long-running Israel-Gaza conflict into the center of global attention. Yet beyond the images of destruction, another conversation has quietly begun to grow among analysts, commentators, and political observers. This conversation revolves around a simple but powerful question. Is fighting a conventional military force fundamentally different from conducting operations in a heavily restricted and densely populated territory like Gaza? Some commentators argue that the current escalation in regional tensions highlights an important contrast between two very different types of warfare. On one side is conventional military confrontation, where organized armies face each other across battlefields using structured strategies, heavy equipment, and coordinated command systems. On the other side is asymmetric conflict, where a powerful military engages with smaller militant groups operating inside dense civilian populations. Understanding why this debate has become so intense requires looking at the broader history of the region. For decades, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been one of the most complicated geopolitical issues in the world. The Gaza Strip, a small coastal territory along the Mediterranean Sea, has often been at the center of that conflict. Despite its small size, roughly 365 square kilometers, Gaza is home to more than 2 million people. It is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. Over the years, the territory has experienced repeated cycles of conflict. Military operations, rocket attacks, airstrikes, and political tensions have created a pattern of escalation followed by fragile periods of calm. For many civilians living there, daily life has been shaped by uncertainty, economic hardship, and limited access to resources. Because of strict border controls and blockades imposed over many years, some international organizations and observers have described Gaza as an open-air prison. They use this term to emphasize how movement in and out of the territory is heavily restricted, and how economic opportunities remain extremely limited. Supporters of Israel strongly reject that characterization. They argue that the restrictions are necessary for security reasons, particularly because Gaza is governed by Hamas, an organization that Israel and several other countries classify as a militant group. From this perspective, Israel's military operations are seen as responses to ongoing security threats, including rocket attacks and other forms of violence. These two competing interpretations, security versus humanitarian concern, have shaped global discussion about Gaza for many years. However, the current debate is not only about Gaza itself. It is also about how warfare changes depending on who is fighting and where the fighting takes place. In conflicts like Gaza, military operations often occur in extremely crowded urban environments. Fighters may operate inside cities where civilians live, work, and try to survive daily life. This creates a battlefield where military targets and civilian spaces exist very close to one another. For military planners, such conditions present enormous challenges. Precision becomes difficult, intelligence becomes critical. Every strike, every movement, and every tactical decision carries the risk of unintended consequences. This kind of conflict is often described as asymmetric warfare. One side typically possesses advanced military capabilities, including air power, modern technology, and large-scale intelligence systems. The other side often relies on smaller units, underground networks, guerrilla tactics, and unconventional strategies. Because of these differences, the battlefield does not look like the traditional wars many people imagine. There are no clear front lines stretching across open terrain. Instead, the battlefield exists inside neighborhoods, streets, and apartment blocks. This is why many analysts say urban warfare is among the most complex forms of combat. Yet some commentators now argue that confronting a structured and organized military force presents an entirely different level of difficulty. A conventional army usually operates with defined command structures, coordinated units, and a wide range of weapon systems. Such forces can defend territory, launch organized counterattacks, and maintain logistical supply lines. When two organized militaries face each other, the conflict becomes more predictable in some ways, but also potentially more dangerous in others. The scale of equipment, manpower, and strategy expands dramatically. For critics of Israel's military operations, the comparison between these two types of warfare has become central to their argument. They claim that confronting a conventional military opponent requires a very different approach than operations conducted in a territory where civilians already face severe economic and political pressures. Supporters of Israel strongly disagree with that interpretation. They emphasize that Hamas itself operates as a militant force capable of launching attacks, building underground networks, and organizing combat operations. From their perspective, the situation in Gaza already involves complex military threats that require serious responses. As a result, the global conversation has become increasingly polarized. Around the world, governments, analysts, journalists, and ordinary citizens continue to debate the meaning of the conflict. Some focus on national security, others focus on humanitarian impact. Many struggle to balance both concerns at the same time. Meanwhile, the conflict continues to evolve on the ground. For business leaders, investors, and political observers, these developments are not only humanitarian or political stories, they are also geopolitical events with global consequences. Instability in the Middle East can influence energy markets, international trade routes, diplomatic alliances, and regional security strategies. Understanding the deeper structure of the conflict therefore requires more than simply watching the latest headlines. It requires asking a deeper question. If the nature of warfare changes depending on the type of opponent and the environment in which the fighting occurs, then what exactly makes conventional military conflicts so fundamentally different from battles fought in dense civilian territories like Gaza? That question leads directly into the strategic realities of modern warfare. When people imagine war, they often picture two large armies facing each other across a battlefield. Tanks moving forward, fighter jets crossing the sky, soldiers advancing in organized formations. For much of modern history, this was the dominant image of warfare. Nations built powerful armies designed specifically to confront other armies. But in the 21st century, many conflicts no longer look like that. Instead, wars are increasingly fought in complex environments where the battlefield is not an open plain but a crowded city. The opponents are not always two organized states, but sometimes a powerful military facing smaller armed groups. These types of conflicts force military planners to rethink almost everything they know about strategy. This is where the difference between conventional warfare and asymmetric warfare becomes crucial. Conventional warfare occurs when two organized military forces confront each other directly. Both sides usually possess structured command systems, standardized equipment, trained soldiers, and coordinated strategies. These forces operate through established military doctrines that guide how battles are fought. In such conflicts, both sides often control defined territories. Front lines emerge. Armies defend positions and attempt to advance against opposing forces. Logistics systems deliver fuel, weapons, and supplies to troops. Intelligence networks track enemy movements. Examples of conventional warfare can be seen throughout history. Large-scale conflicts such as World War II or more recent interstate wars involved organized armies confronting each other across wide battle zones. In those situations, military power is measured through visible capabilities. The number of soldiers, the strength of armored divisions, the reach of air forces, and the ability to sustain operations over long periods become decisive factors. However, the dynamics change dramatically when a powerful military force faces a smaller, less conventional opponent. This type of conflict is commonly described as asymmetric warfare. The term refers to situations where the two sides possess very different levels of military capability. One side may have advanced aircraft, satellites, sophisticated intelligence networks, and highly trained forces. The other side may rely on mobility, secrecy, and unconventional tactics. In asymmetric conflicts, the weaker side rarely attempts to fight the stronger military in direct open battle. Instead, it adopts strategies designed to offset the technological advantage of its opponent. This can include guerrilla tactics, underground networks, surprise attacks, and operations within densely populated areas. The goal is often to avoid large confrontations while maintaining the ability to continue fighting over long periods. Urban environments make this strategy even more complicated. Cities create one of the most difficult battlefields for any military. Buildings limit visibility, narrow streets restrict vehicle movement, civilian populations live among potential military targets. Infrastructure such as hospitals, schools, and residential areas exists close to combat zones. Every military decision becomes more complicated in such environments. Precision becomes essential. Intelligence gathering becomes more difficult. Even technologically advanced forces must operate with extreme caution because mistakes can cause civilian casualties or destroy critical infrastructure. For this reason, military experts often describe urban warfare as one of the most demanding forms of combat. Yet some analysts argue that confronting a structured military opponent introduces an entirely different challenge. When facing a conventional army, the opponent has organized battalions, artillery systems, air defenses, and coordinated leadership. That army can defend territory, conduct strategic maneuvers, and launch counterattacks designed to disrupt enemy operations. In such situations, the battlefield becomes larger and more dynamic. Armies must protect supply lines, coordinate movements across multiple units, and anticipate complex strategies from their opponent. The presence of a conventional military force also means that the conflict can escalate rapidly. Larger weapon systems, advanced missile capabilities, and organized air operations increase both the scale and the speed of warfare. This difference lies at the heart of the debate now circulating among many commentators. Some critics argue that military operations in Gaza have taken place within a territory where civilians already face significant economic and political constraints. In their view, fighting inside such an environment creates humanitarian risks that are different from the challenges of confronting a conventional army. Others strongly disagree with that perspective. Supporters of Israel's security strategy argue that Hamas itself operates as a structured militant organization capable of planning attacks, building extensive underground infrastructure, and maintaining armed units. From their perspective, the situation in Gaza already involves organized military threats that require serious defensive responses. Because of these competing interpretations, discussions about the conflict often become highly polarized. International audiences see the same events, but interpret them through very different lenses. Some focus primarily on security threats and the need for military defense. Others emphasize humanitarian conditions and the risks civilians face during military operations. This tension between security strategy and humanitarian concern has become one of the defining features of modern conflicts. Meanwhile, military planners around the world continue studying how these different forms of warfare interact. They examine how armies adapt when fighting inside cities. They analyze how smaller forces challenge larger militaries. They study how technology, intelligence, and strategy evolve in response to changing battlefields. The central lesson emerging from these studies is that modern warfare rarely follows a single predictable pattern. Conflicts can shift between asymmetric and conventional dynamics depending on who is involved and how the fighting develops. A war that begins as a localized confrontation can expand into a broader regional conflict. A conflict dominated by irregular forces can evolve into something resembling traditional military engagement. This unpredictability is precisely why analysts continue asking a deeper question. If the structure of war changes depending on the opponent, the battlefield, and the political environment, then how does the humanitarian dimension of conflict shape the global reaction that follows? War is rarely fought only on the battlefield. In the modern world, every conflict also unfolds across television screens, mobile phones, and digital platforms. Images travel instantly, stories spread rapidly, and public opinion forms long before the smoke from explosions has even cleared. In the case of Gaza, this reality has become impossible to ignore. Over the years, the territory has repeatedly appeared in global headlines because of the humanitarian conditions faced by civilians living there. With more than 2 million people living in a very small area, Gaza's population density is among the highest in the world. Families live close together, often in large apartment blocks and crowded neighborhoods. When conflict erupts in such an environment, the effects reach civilians almost immediately. Reports frequently describe damaged infrastructure, shortages of medical supplies, and interruptions to electricity and water services. Hospitals can become overwhelmed. Aid organizations often struggle to deliver assistance quickly enough to meet urgent needs. For humanitarian groups, these conditions are deeply concerning. Organizations that monitor global crises regularly highlight the challenges civilians face in conflict zones like Gaza. They point to limited access to resources, restricted movement, and the difficulties of rebuilding infrastructure after repeated cycles of violence. These concerns have fueled a powerful global conversation about the humanitarian consequences of the conflict. At the same time, Israeli officials emphasize that their military operations are conducted in response to ongoing security threats. They argue that militant groups operating from Gaza have launched rockets, organized attacks, and built extensive underground networks designed to support military activities. From this perspective, Israel views its actions as necessary defensive measures aimed at protecting its population and preventing further attacks. This creates a situation where two narratives exist side by side. One narrative focuses on security, the other focuses on humanitarian impact. Both perspectives shape how people around the world interpret the conflict. In modern geopolitics, public perception matters almost as much as military strategy. Governments pay close attention to how global audiences respond to events on the ground. Diplomatic pressure, international protests, and public statements from world leaders can influence how conflicts evolve. The Gaza conflict has become one of the clearest examples of this dynamic. In cities across Europe, North America, Asia, and the Middle East, demonstrations have taken place as people express their views about the conflict. Some rallies call for stronger humanitarian protections for civilians. Others emphasize Israel's right to defend itself against attacks. These reactions show just how deeply divided global opinion can be. For journalists and analysts, the challenge is to explain events clearly while navigating a landscape filled with powerful emotions and political sensitivities. Every image, every headline, and every statement can shape how millions of people understand what is happening. Social media has amplified this effect dramatically. Unlike earlier eras of conflict, today's wars unfold in real time for global audiences. videos recorded on mobile phones can spread across the internet within minutes. Images from the battlefield can influence international debate almost instantly. This rapid flow of information can bring attention to humanitarian suffering, but it can also intensify disagreements about what those images represent. One group may see evidence of military aggression, another may see the consequences of a defensive operation. The same event can produce completely different interpretations depending on the viewer's perspective. Because of this, conflicts like the one in Gaza often become not only military confrontations, but also information battles. Governments release official statements. Advocacy groups publish reports. Media organizations analyze events from multiple angles. Experts appear on television to explain military strategy, political context, and humanitarian concerns. Each of these voices contributes to a global conversation that is constantly evolving. Meanwhile, the people living inside the conflict zone continue to face the immediate realities of war. Families seek shelter during airstrikes. Medical teams treat injured civilians. Aid workers attempt to deliver food, water, and medical supplies despite difficult conditions. These experiences shape how local communities understand the conflict in ways that outsiders may never fully see. For the international community, the humanitarian dimension of the Gaza conflict raises difficult questions. How can military operations be conducted while minimizing civilian harm? What responsibilities do governments have to protect non-combatants? And how should global institutions respond when humanitarian crises emerge during armed conflict? These questions have no simple answers. International law establishes principles intended to protect civilians during war, including rules governing proportionality, distinction between military and civilian targets, and humanitarian assistance. But applying these principles in real-world conflicts can be extremely complicated. Urban battlefields, underground networks, and rapidly changing combat situations create conditions where perfect solutions rarely exist. As a result, debates about Gaza often extend far beyond the region itself. They become part of larger discussions about how modern warfare should be conducted and what ethical responsibilities nations carry when engaging in military operations. For global audiences watching from afar, these debates can feel overwhelming. The conflict appears both intensely local and deeply international at the same time. Yet beneath all the arguments, one reality remains constant. War does not only reshape territory, it reshapes lives, communities, and political relationships across entire regions. And as global leaders continue to respond to events in Gaza, another critical question begins to emerge. If humanitarian crises and military strategy are now deeply intertwined, then how do political leaders and global powers navigate the strategic consequences of such conflicts on the international stage? Behind every war lies another battlefield that is far less visible but equally important. It is the battlefield of strategy, diplomacy, and global power. While soldiers move on the ground and aircraft operate in the skies, political leaders around the world are carefully calculating what each development means for their own security, alliances, and economic stability. The conflict involving Gaza does not exist in isolation. It sits at the center of one of the most politically sensitive regions in the world. The Middle East has long been a crossroads of global interests. Major energy routes pass through the region. Strategic waterways, such as the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz, connect global trade networks. Oil and natural gas from the region play a crucial role in the world economy. Because of this, instability in the Middle East can quickly ripple outward, affecting markets, governments, and businesses far beyond the region itself. For political leaders, every escalation creates difficult choices. In Israel, decision-makers face the challenge of balancing national security with international scrutiny. Protecting citizens from attacks remains a central priority for Israeli leadership. At the same time, military actions are closely watched by foreign governments, humanitarian organizations, and global media outlets. This means that every military decision carries both strategic and diplomatic consequences. Leaders must consider not only immediate battlefield objectives, but also how those actions will be interpreted by allies, rivals, and international institutions. Statements from foreign ministries, votes at the United Nations, and diplomatic negotiations can influence how a conflict evolves over time. At the same moment, leaders in neighboring countries are also watching carefully. Many governments in the Middle East must balance domestic public opinion with regional political realities. Citizens in various countries often react strongly to developments in Gaza, especially when humanitarian concerns dominate global headlines. Political leaders must therefore manage both external diplomacy and internal pressures from their own populations. This balancing act can be extremely delicate. If tensions expand beyond Gaza, there is always the risk that other regional actors could become more directly involved. Such developments would significantly change the strategic landscape of the conflict. Military planners and analysts constantly study these possibilities because the Middle East has historically experienced conflicts that spread beyond their original boundaries. For global powers, the situation introduces another layer of complexity. Countries such as the United States, Russia, and several European states maintain strong political and economic interests in the region. Their governments often play diplomatic roles, encouraging ceasefires, negotiating humanitarian corridors, or supporting broader peace initiatives. These external actors also consider how regional instability might influence international trade, energy markets, and geopolitical alliances. For example, disruptions in the Middle East can affect oil prices, shipping routes, and investment flows. Businesses that depend on stable global supply chains monitor these developments closely. Investors pay attention to political risks that could influence markets. Governments analyze whether prolonged instability might require economic adjustments or strategic responses. In this way, a conflict that appears local can quickly become a global concern. Entrepreneurs, corporate leaders, and financial analysts often study geopolitical risks because political events can shape economic opportunities and challenges. A sudden escalation in conflict can affect currency values, energy costs, and international partnerships. This is why geopolitical awareness has become increasingly important for people working in business and global markets. Understanding this strategic environment allows decision makers to anticipate possible disruptions and plan accordingly. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts continue behind the scenes. International organizations frequently attempt to encourage negotiations aimed at reducing violence. Humanitarian agencies call for pauses in fighting to allow aid deliveries. Political leaders engage in discussions designed to prevent further escalation. Sometimes these efforts succeed, sometimes they struggle to gain momentum. Conflicts that involve deep historical grievances and complex security concerns rarely resolve quickly. They require long-term political solutions that address both safety and stability. For analysts observing the situation, the central issue remains the evolving nature of modern warfare. The Gaza conflict highlights how military strategy, humanitarian conditions, and international politics have become deeply interconnected. Decisions made on the battlefield can trigger reactions across diplomatic networks, economic systems, and global public opinion. Each development becomes part of a larger geopolitical puzzle. As this story continues to unfold, experts around the world continue asking the same fundamental question that first sparked this debate. If confronting a conventional army changes the structure of war, and if urban conflicts reshape how militaries operate, then what does this evolving landscape reveal about the future of warfare itself? Because the answer to that question may determine not only the future of conflicts in the Middle East, but also the strategic challenges that nations, businesses, and societies will face in the decades ahead.